On May 3, 1946, the prisoner Willie Francis felt approximately 2,000 volts of electricity surge through his body as he was subjected to execution in the electric chair. But he miraculously survived, and what happened next was truly unbelievable. Here are 10 stories of prisoners who, against all odds, survived their own executions and the shocking details of what happened afterward. 10.
Kenneth Smith court documents say convicted killer Kenneth Smith remained strapped to a gurney for hours.
Attorneys say that he was repeatedly jabbed with needles in his arms and hands.
On November 17, 2022, the American murderer Kenneth Smith was brought to the death chamber for his execution, even though there was a clear order from one of the country's highest courts to halt the process. Smith was a hired killer in the 80s. He was hired by a preacher named Charles Sennett Sr. to kill his own wife, Elizabeth Sennett. Charles was in a lot of debt at that time, so he decided to have his wife killed. To get the life insurance, he paid Smith and another man, John Forrest Parker, $1,000 each to commit the crime. But the plan didn't go as expected because Smith was caught and was eventually sentenced to death. He spent 33 years on death row before the date of his execution was finally set. But on the very day of the execution, the 3 personnel who were supposed to inject the lethal drugs couldn't find a suitable vein. They repeatedly jabbed him in the arm while he screamed and begged them to stop. At one point, they even stuck the needle into his muscle, causing him even more intense pain. According to Smith himself, when they couldn't find a usable vein, they ordered the guards to flip the gurney so that my feet were pointing at the ceiling while my head was hanging down toward the floor like an upside-down crucifixion. Their face masks were already damaged, and eventually they even stuck the needle into his collarbone. They tried to insert a central lined V into the subclavian artery. After almost 4 hours of non-stop attempts to inject the drug, he was just returned to his cell in compliance with the earlier court order to halt the execution. His lawyers described what he went through as a horrifying and traumatic experience, and surely many would agree with that. But no matter how bad that was, things are about to get even worse for Smith. Because the US has come up with a new way to execute him using nitrogen. On August 26, 2023, the state of Alabama decided to carry out his execution by nitrogen hypoxia. This method has never been used before. But because Smith has escaped death several times, they believe this is the only way to finally end his life. All he needs to do is inhale that gas and it will all be over. But the question is, will he be able to escape death this time? I don't think so. Number 9, Rommel Broom. On September 15, 2009, convicted murderer and rapist Rommel Broom was scheduled to be executed by lethal injection in the state of Ohio. But something unexpected happened. The executioners encountered a problem that prevented them from carrying out Broom's execution that day. Before moving to Ohio at the age of 5, he was with his mother. When he arrived in Ohio, he fell in with the wrong crowd. People whose influence completely changed the direction of his life. His first recorded crime was in 1974, where he robbed motorists of their vehicles. But it didn't end there. Things got even worse. He started to harm women, and on several occasions he even took their lives. But the case that ultimately led him to the death penalty was the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of a young girl named Trina Middleton. He abducted Trina while she was walking home with her 2 friends from a football game in East Cleveland, Ohio. Later on, Broom was proven to be involved in the crime through DNA testing. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection. But ironically, that's where his unusual story began. For almost 2 hours during his execution, the executioners couldn't find the right vein for the IV to inject the lethal drugs. He was repeatedly pricked with needles, and each prick caused intense pain. Because the process was so difficult, the Ohio government was forced to stop the execution. At first, it was only postponed for a week, but that 1 week turned into years as his lawyers continued to fight for his appeal. Even Broom himself wrote a book about his horrifying experience on that day. After he survived his execution in 2009, he was again scheduled to undergo execution on March 16th. But before that could happen on December 2020, Rommel Broom passed away due to complications from COVID. Although he ultimately passed away while on death row, it can also be said that in a way, he overcame death and he lived longer than what the government had set for him. On February 23, 1885, they tried to execute John Lee 3 times and all attempts failed. John Lee was born on August 15, 1864 in England. At the age of 21, he was convicted of killing his employer, Emma Case. The main evidence against him was that he was the only man in the house on the night the crime happened, along with his previous criminal record and some wounds on his arm. But Lee insisted on his innocence. Despite this, he was sentenced to death. The day of his execution arrived, the rope was placed around his neck, his head was covered, and the executioner pulled the lever to open the trap door, but it didn't work. He tried repeatedly, but nothing happened. It was a huge embarrassment for everyone involved, so the medical examiner was forced to temporarily stop the execution. Lee was returned to his cell while the mechanism was being examined, and surprisingly, it worked perfectly during testing, but whenever Lee was the one standing on it, the trap door wouldn't open. Throughout the whole incident, Lee remained calm. He even said that his faith in God would save him. And what happened next? Eventually, the judge changed his sentence from death to life imprisonment. But after many appeals and new evidence came out suggesting that he might not have been the only man in the house on the night of the crime, John Lee was proven innocent. So perhaps there really was a strange force that saved him that day. Until now, it remains a mystery what really happened. And another mystery is what happened to him after he was released in 1907. Some say he died at Tavistock Workhouse during World War II, while others believe he moved to America, became a lecturer, and died in Milwaukee in 2009. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain. John Lee will be remembered as the man they couldn't kill. On December 14, 1650, an English domestic servant named Anne Green was executed on a charge of infanticide, the deliberate killing of an infant. It's a very old story, but even today, people still talk about it because of what happened. Anne was born in 1628. She worked as a maid in the house of Sir Thomas Red, a justice of the peace in Oxfordshire, England. While she was there, she became pregnant after being seduced by Sir Thomas's grandson, Geoffrey Reed. After 17 weeks, she had a miscarriage. She tried to hide the fetus's remains, but eventually it was discovered, and she was accused of a crime. You probably already guessed what happened next. She was sentenced to death. But this is where the story took a dramatic twist. Anne was hanged at Oxford Castle for 30 minutes, and when they assumed she was gone, her body was taken down, placed in a coffin, and given to the doctors at the University of Oxford for dissection. But what they didn't know was that she was still alive. For 24 hours, she was inside the coffin. No food, almost no air, and no water. Until a doctor tried to cut her body and noticed that she still had a pulse. Just imagine the doctor's shock when Anne's body suddenly moved. She was immediately treated by the other doctors, and after a few hours, she was able to speak and move again. 3 days after her execution, Sir Thomas, the man who had the power to oppose her pardon, died. Because of this, nothing stopped her release. Although some protested and wanted her execution to be carried out again, it did not happen. Anne Green was released as a free person. And as many expected, some believed that a divine intervention had occurred. In the end, she lived a good life, got married, had 3 children, and died in 1659. Number 5, Willie Francis. We've seen people survive lethal injection, but surviving the electric chair seems impossible. But there was an African American named Willie who managed to survive it. In 1946, he was put in the electric chair and miraculously survived. 2 years before that, a pharmacist in St. Martinville, Louisiana, named Andrew Thomas was shot and killed. According to reports, Thomas was accused of abusing young boys in their area. That's why many believe that Francis was one of his victims. The case remained unsolved for 9 months, until August of 1945 when Willie Francis was arrested as the main suspect. According to the police, he had Thomas's wallet, but no evidence was presented in court to prove this. In addition, the weapon and bullets used in the crime actually matched those owned by the deputy sheriff of St. Martinville, Auguste Fuselier. So the question is, what was Francis really involved in? The answer seems to be nothing. There was no solid evidence against him except for the 2 written confessions that were believed to have been forced. And during the trial itself, the court-appointed lawyers assigned to defend him did almost nothing. No objections, no witnesses, and no clear defense, even though it was only 2 days since his trial began. Francis was found guilty by a jury composed of 12 white members, even though he was a minor. The judge predicted his fate, death. On May 3, 1946, his execution was carried out. But in an unbelievable turn of events, he survived the electric chair. Later, it was discovered that the portable electric chair was set up incorrectly, and the prison guard who arranged it was drunk, so the flow of electricity was not proper. After that incident, a lawyer named Bertrand de Blanc helped with Francis's case. He tried to convince the Supreme Court to overturn the verdict. He even presented new details, such as the disappearance of the weapon, bullets, and even Andrew Thomas's body a few days before the trial. It was clear that something suspicious was happening, and it's possible that Francis was simply being falsely accused. But despite everything, the U.S. Supreme Court denied the appeal. On May 9, 1947, Willie Francis was returned to the electric chair. And this time, he did not survive. Before he died, he told a reporter, "I'm going to the Lord wearing my Sunday pants and Sunday heart." A case that even today is disheartening to think about. A man survived thousands of volts of electricity but could not survive the system. Number 4, Alan Eugene Miller. At this point, it seems like the state of Alabama should just ban lethal injection because it looks like they can't do it right. And in the case of Alan Eugene Miller, he almost died. Not because of the lethal drugs, but because of the repeated needle pricks to his body. On September 22, 2022, his execution was scheduled to be carried out by lethal injection. He was sentenced for killing 3 people, Lee Holbrooks, Christopher Scott Yancey, and Terry Jarvis in 1999 during a delusional episode. But on the day of the execution, there was another problem. The executioners couldn't find the right vein for the IV. They repeatedly stuck needles into his arms, hands, and feet. More than an hour and a half had passed, and they still couldn't get a line. In desperation, they almost continuously stuck into his flesh, hoping to find a vein. Miller could feel every prick, every pain, every time the needle pierced his skin. After almost 2 hours, he was tied to the gurney. It was stood upright while his hands and feet were injured, and then he was left in the execution chamber to die. But after almost 30 minutes, he was brought back. His wounds were stitched, and he was taken to his cell. He survived. Now his lawyers continue to fight to change the method of his execution, because it's clear that the state of Alabama cannot properly carry out executions by lethal injection. Miller's case is yet another proof, the third in just 4 years, that this type of execution has failed. And above all, he can no longer go through the trauma and pain he experienced again. As of now, Alan Eugene Miller is one of the few death row inmates who are still alive to this day. Number 3, John Smith. If there's a record for the most times someone has survived execution, John Smith probably holds it. Born in 1661, Smith was a housebreaker and petty thief in London. But before he turned to crime, he served at sea. He first served in the Navy as a merchantman and later on a man of war. He was discharged after the famous Battle of Vigo Bay, but it wasn't long before he enlisted as a soldier. where he fell in with the wrong crowd that eventually pushed him into a life of crime. On December 5, 1705, Smith was found guilty on 2 charges and sentenced to death. At first, he seemed indifferent, but when the day of his execution came, his family was in turmoil. They did everything to lessen his suffering. And after he was hanging for almost 15 minutes and still didn't die, they took him down and brought him to a house to recover. In February 2076, he was granted parole because of the trauma he experienced. But this is where the story started to become even stranger. After being released, he went back to his old ways, stealing, and he was caught again. But because of the complications of his case and his previous sentence, he got away without any additional punishment. But he still didn't change. For the 3rd time, he was arrested again because of housebreaking, and it seemed clear that he really needed to be executed. But one day, before his trial, the prosecutor died. And once again, John Smith was set free. A man who seemed to be followed by luck. And what's surprising is that it didn't end there. On May 17, 1727, 66-year-old John Smith was caught while trying to steal a padlock with a friend. His companion escaped, but he was caught. It was proven that he was trying to break into a warehouse, and here he received his 3rd sentence, penal transportation to Virginia. Smith pleaded to be given physical punishment instead, but this was denied. In the end, he was imprisoned and exiled from the city, leaving his family behind. From then on, no one knew what happened to him. But based on his story, we hope that his unusual luck still stayed with him. Number 2, Joseph Samuel. In 1795, a German named Joseph Samuel was sentenced and exiled to Britain's penal colony. But he did something unexpected, which ultimately led him to the death penalty. At that time, Britain had a penal settlement in Sydney. Samuel and some prisoners escaped from there and returned after their escape. They robbed the house of a wealthy woman, and in the process, the policeman guarding it was killed. Because of the gravity of the crime, the authorities immediately searched for and captured them. During the trial, the woman specifically pointed to Samuel as the culprit. He admitted to the theft but denied the killing. Despite this, he was the only one sentenced to death by execution. On September 26, 1803, his execution was carried out. The rope used could hold up to 450 kilos, enough to take a person's life. But while the other prisoners were slowly being executed, Samuel's rope snapped. He fell to the ground. The executioner quickly got another rope and tried again. But when the cart was removed from under his feet, the knot loosened and he fell again. The executioner was confused. He was sure the knot was tied properly. But what was really happening? At that point, Samuel was already injured, especially his foot. But the executioner still didn't stop. He prepared the rope again, tied it tightly, and the execution was carried out again. But for the 3rd time, the rope gave way once more, and he fell to the ground. This time, the crowd watching went wild. They shouted, demanding Samuel's release. Because of the chaos, the chief policeman was forced to postpone the execution until the governor arrived. He inspected the ropes. There were no signs of damage or breakage. And because the other prisoners were executed using the same rope, the governor decided that maybe this was a sign from God, that Joseph Samuel should not be executed, and his sentence was changed from death to life imprisonment. Number 1, Wenceslao Mogel. And for the last one, a story that will surely keep you hooked until the end. Born on November 1, 1896, Wesley Miguel was a Mexican soldier under Army General Francisco Bonova. But when the Mexican Revolution broke out, he was captured and sentenced to death by firing squad, one of the most brutal methods of execution. But in an unbelievable turn of events, he survived on the day of his execution. He was hit by 8 or 9 bullets in the body, and to make sure he was really gone, he was hit by one last bullet in the head. But after everything, Miguel realized he was still alive. And instead of moving, he pretended to be dead so they wouldn't shoot him again. When his body was taken down in the darkness of the night, he moved slowly until he reached the Church of St. James the Apostle, just 3 blocks away. There he was found by a member of the church who immediately took him to his home and cared for him until he recovered. He may have been left with a permanent scar and his appearance was forever changed. But one thing is certain, he survived through all of these stories. We can see that the line between life and death is sometimes very thin. And no matter how final a verdict may seem, there are times when the system fails. But remember, all this information is based on different sources and reports from the internet and experts. So, what do you think? Is all of this just luck? Or is there a deeper reason behind it? If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Noel Polo TV.